Thank you, Mark, and I want to really thank UCI for even ideating a conference like this and sort of doing a deeper dive, trying to at least a call to action academically and also programmatically of how Scholastic Esports should be thought about or can be thought about, because I don't think there's a right or wrong way. But so a big thanks to just Mark and his whole team and the whole campus for really doing a deep dive and wanting to sort of bring everyone together to figure it out. So my name is Kurt Melcher. In 2014, as an athletic director and coach of a small NAI school, I kind of ideated a way or a concept to bring Varsity Esports into an athletic department where we would build a facility on campus, hire coaching staff, scholarship, talented players at the same levels as we do traditional sports. My story's been told ad nauseum in this space. I gave a TEDx talk in 2015. If you want to hear the whole reason why and the background for it, it's much better spelled out there. In 2016, I moved over full-time to a company called Intersport, which is a sports media production consultant agency in Chicago, dealing with more traditional sports, but I came on for esports. I still am involved with Robert Morris. I don't handle the day-to-day programming, but I really is almost like a consultant. I'm there every 2 weeks. They call me like the fixer. If there's a problem or to translate between administration and esports, I kind of come in and sort of like help facilitate that. So in 2017, in November, the NCAA issued an RFP to try to understand what was happening in the collegiate space. Really, it was more of a reaction to they were fielding so many questions from membership, saying like, "Hey, how do we do this esports stuff? You know, like you guys, what do we do, and where does it live?" And they're like, "We don't. What do you mean? Like, it has nothing to do with them." But they knew that members were asking it as a member service sort of association. They said, "Hey, we need to figure out what's going on here, and like, what is it even?" So we were hired. And for the better part of 2 years plus now, we've been their partner in this exploration process. Now, as a disclaimer for the stream and for my life, I do not speak for or behalf of the NCAA. What you're going to hear is my own interpretation of some of these results. So I do not speak for the NCAA in this thing. So you could rewind that in chat or whatever. And really, but one thing that I feel safe in saying is that the NCAA does not really do a great job of outward messaging related to, in my opinion, any of the initiatives or sports. So really what I want to take everyone through is just have a better understanding of what that process was, present some of the data. It's kind of 2 years old now, but like still was really have you up on like intent. Like what are schools doing? Why are they approaching esports? How are they onboarding it? And what are the reasons behind that? So I think presenting some of that data just helps us all think about it in different ways, and also where that process is now related to NCAA. So really, we'll take you through like the esports ecosystem and where it's kind of come from, where it is now. Go through that background of how we approached it. Kind of deep dive into like some of those findings and some of those big takeaways, the global takeaways. And also then like of kind of how I see the space and what a potential path forward is for all of us kind of collectively. So if you look at the collegiate esports ecosystem, it is really fragmented and kind of messy, where there's a lot of different platforms and different ways to engage and onboard esports or support different groups on campus. If you look across publishers and publisher initiatives, you think about ULOL, then CLOL, then RSAA, and TESPA, and Heroes of the Dorm, which is Heroes of the Storm, which is no longer. It's and I will have to call out like that there would be, in my opinion, like it's really collegiate esports is developed through the support of key publishers that really recognize the community on campus. So I think you say publishers have really done a good job of fostering and cultivating this group, but really it was started by students, where students love to play certain titles, would organize themselves and would try to organize competitions, sometimes in tournament fashion. Michael Sherman from Riot is sitting right there. He was one of those students. He organized iBUYPOWER, which was a platform. He organized different events around just because he was passionate about some of those titles, right? So publishers recognizing that say, hey, there's something here. We should really take care of this community and try to elevate it. And that's kind of where I believe it's sort of stemmed and have grown for. And through that time, we see different like competitive leagues and platforms like Collegiate Star League, a number of others like Collegiate Carball related to Rocket League, and a lot of these have really added value, I believe, to the sort of collegiate esports ecosystem, but it also creates a lot of confusion. And if an administrator sort of wants to look at the collegiate space and they see this, they're like, oh, I don't even know where to start. Let's kind of wait a little bit. Interesting to see conferences beginning to become interested in the space for a number of different reasons and a variety of reasons, and onboarding esports, even though largely those aren't operating out of athletics, but conferences have sort of a unique, conferences exist because it's like-minded and similar sort of set of schools that has somewhat of a shared value set. So if an administrator within or presidents within that conference sort of identify like, hey, this feels like we should be doing something in this space. Athletics, maybe they don't want it, and maybe it's not best served there right now, but we should, as a like-minded group of schools, do something surrounding this. I think about the Big East Initiative and how they've kind of approached it and onboarded, where when they were voted, should they continue esports after 2 pilot years, athletic director's vote was, I think, 11 no's, 1 yes. President's vote were 12 yes. So they're like, okay, I guess we're doing it somehow. But it is shared values of like-minded competition that sort of makes sense in a grouping, in a setting, right? Similar to kind of Peach Belt and a couple of the other conferences that we see. And then another interesting part of this ecosystem is what we've seen over the last couple of years are like different governing bodies or different related associations to the space. Like the forefront comes like NACE, offshoot of the NAI, the NAC. There's so many acronyms, but like the coaching and director ones. So, but a lot of them, want to like form the space. EGF is say like, hey, we're going to be the NCAA of esports. We'll create a system which everyone can understand, and maybe there's different ways to be able to monetize like this closed circuit where it'll be self-sustaining. So a lot of different models surrounding that. So when we began, again, this is 2 years old, but when we began the sort of research, and it was like 10 months of research, we went about it like in a qualitative and quantitative method, where we sent out first like a survey, which was specific to who it was approaching. So we approached with the survey an administrator on campus of somebody that was in charge of esports, if it was in a club setting or wherever it lived. We reached out to an athletic representative on that campus, and then the student lead on that campus. And depending upon who that was, the question pathing would, as we know, no one likes to do surveys, so it was like 12 questions, just to sort of base a form to then reach back out in-person conversations or on the phone to help sort of path that qualitative outreach. And then through that process, really, and I'll go into more of what we did, was we brought all that information in, disseminated it, brought it to the NCAA, took it back out to stakeholders, and I'll go back in the university level of presidents and directors and such, and ideated off of that. So the way we approached sort of that reach out was by pooling universities, and again, the intent of like this exercise was to determine how are schools approaching this space, and if they're not, why not, and thought processes behind that. So we grouped schools. We wound up reaching out to, I'd say, over 125 universities and conferences. So pool one was really of varsity programs, right? And those are somewhat, I should say formal, right? Varsity is hard to define. What's the difference between formal and varsity? So we defined formal by saying okay, if the school's putting any kind of formal support against it, a facility, staffing, operating budget, rights to the marks and logos, that's sort of formal support. So there could be a formal program that is not scholarshiping talent, it's just providing a space on campus dedicated to those activities. And perhaps there's coaching staff, doesn't have to be full-time. So it's like low barrier for sort of formal of what you would kind of consider. So that's pool one. Pool two, we identified schools that had elevated club programs and potentially club designation. Now there's no, those in student services know there's no clear-cut sort of definition of what an official club is on campus, because it varies on how schools onboard that. But we identified like schools that are actively engaged in hosting events, have some sort of internal governance, are really well organized, and have some persistence over the years of it's just an ongoing sort of cycle of success in their esports. The UCI would have been, pre-formal or varsity would have been the ideal sort of pool 2 school. And pool 3 was really of like students that were could have persistence, but were like on their own. They're like bootstrapping. They're trying to find a space on campus. They're trying to find some help on campus. Sometimes they're playing from their dorms. Sometimes they're running, selling cupcakes to try to get some funding. It's just on their own. It's student-led 100%. And pool 4, this is going to be my downfall. Somebody, Sherman, raise your, do something if I'm off base. Pool 4 is on again and off again programs, which had been like the, Jim Belushi, that has been this sort of, right? So like students that take on as a sophomore all of the work of setting up programs and setting up events, but then they matriculate, they graduate, and then the other students are like, that was a lot of work, I'm not doing that. And then the club kind of goes downhill and sort of evaporates until that next subset of students come in and say like, this is great, I'm gonna do all this, and it comes back to life. So looking at kind of some of those questions, again, it was like 12 maximum responses delivered down, really drilled down to where it's landing and who we're talking to. So we received 112 unique responses across that, which, I'm not a researcher. I leaned a lot on the formation of the questions on a research lecture, but we had a 95% school completion rate, which I guess is unbelievable and spectacular. So even though I don't know, I should be proud about it. We're proud about that. But really what we kind of like derived out of that were like some core sort of sentiments, and then it'll get kind of vetted out by some of the data. Now this is just like a tertiary look at the data. It's really simple, but it's going to kind of lead into sort of a broader narrative of the kind of big findings that we've pulled out. But like some of those like 3 core sentiments were like knowledge of esports as a whole from campus administrators. Like, what are you talking about? What is it? It's video games. Awareness of activity on campus. Like, we have a club. What do you mean? Like, there's 600 kids in the club. No, there's not. I would know about it. Well, they're playing from the dorms, whatever. And then also like, what's the approach to, or the attitudinal data or not data, but attitude towards esports and to gaming, right? Can it provide value in any sort of way, or is it like viewed as kind of a waste of time? So it has again, this is a simplified version. We're going to crank through this. As your esports group approached administration regarding creating a formal esports program, and this is again, looking at pool 2, 3, and 4, remembering pool 1 are formal programs already. Pool 2, those really hyper-organized. They have self-governance, some class support, some institutional support. 75% of them have, and that's not surprising, right? Because for 10 years, students have been banging the door of administrators like, pay attention to us, we're worthy of help, and we need help. Pool 3, again, students working hard, have zero support. They're like, why would we do that? We can't even get a room to play on the Saturday matches for us. And pool 4, on again, off again program, they're like, of course not. How well do you feel the university supports your esports group? Again, knowing number 1, pool 1 is formal programs, and hopefully that's a positive. Pool 2, you could see a general feeling of apathy and probably a little disenfranchised, right? Particularly in light, I believe, of like pool 1, right? They see every day a university onboarding a formal program and doing things. They're like, oh my gosh, we've been doing this for 7 years. I've bled for this, and we can't get any help. And pool 2 and 3, obviously, kind of low numbers as well, as you'd expect. And then we asked a baseline question: how knowledgeable are you about esports? And again, looking across the different pools, going down, right? Pool 1, 2, 3, 4, and across to formal, down formal club, student-led, and on again and off again. Administrators from pool 1 and athletics and students. What was interesting to us, and this was sort of formed in the reach out also, was like the administrators and athletics administrators that were sort of forced to become involved because, as we know, pool 1 is formal, report better outcomes of like knowledgeable, right? So even in pool 1, if we see like administrative data, again, it was out of 1 out of 7, it's like 6.8, and athletics is 4.5, kind of lower, but we know that not a lot of programs potentially were in athletics, but still descending values across the organizational efforts of institutions, which we found finding. We see that sort of graphed out in a similar fashion through all the data of across the pools of sort of like admins, athletics, students, of course, think there's value. And really, this is the one that, with all the data sets leading up to this, was like the home run when it was like, do you believe an esports program can add value to students on your campus? Pool 1, varsities, administrators, yes, because they see it and they recognize it and they're doing it. Athletics, even if it's not in athletics, they see and they recognize value, right? I have a feeling at University of, or at Indiana Wesleyan University, like the football coach is probably saying like, are you serious? The esports team was flown out to Irvine, California to play a match. So they see value in some regard, right? But in pool 2, again, administrators see higher value outcomes because they're forced to. Again, if you think about pool 2, it's those super active clubs on campus that are running events. So it's not like those pool 2 administrators want to, but they're forced to be engaged and help that group and onboard them and run their events. And then through that interactivity, they recognize that there is a value proposition available in esports because they see the true outcomes of students. They see it every day and they see what it can mean and what it means to this group on campus. They see the firsthand benefits. So when we kind of boil it down across the pools, we just kind of pull out some like general insights, right? So like pool 1, varsity sports programs identify significant value in potentially improved structures and organization through, particularly in the light of how I think campus administrators and athletic administrators engage with or plan events, right? And we said this ad nauseum, and AJ Dimmick is somewhere here, like giving me a hell yeah, because he's on the hype train of like, we need to know athletic schedules, esports schedules as much in advance so we can merchandise it on campus and do well by our students, similar to traditional athletics. So there is a recognition point in formal programs saying like, man, if we could get a little more organized and put together, and publishers are doing a much better job of this, and they understand the weaknesses that are surrounding that, and they are doing better. But I think holistically, even conference-wise and everything else, just structures, improved structures would help those formal/varsity esports efforts. Out of pool 2, kind of big takeaways were, not surprising that those massive esports clubs feel disenfranchised, right? They feel let down by all the effort they put in, particularly in light of, in my opinion, like what's happening in the formal space and how things are getting onboarded. And they would like also legitimization of what they're doing. Pool 3, conferences at universities or university conferences recognize potential like congruent values, right, to potential organized esports, but they're cautious, not really sure how to do that if it's not particularly housed in athletics. So it's like maybe we should, because we could see it could be potential. Maybe we can monetize this. Maybe it'd be good for the students, create some persistence in our brand and the university, but I don't know how to do it, so it leads to a little trepidation and a little bit of like waiting on the sidelines, even though we have seen sort of an increase in conference participation. And I think out of the pool 4, a lot of schools are, and this is data from and insights from 2 years ago, which I think is starting to interestingly solve itself in some ways, but like a lot of schools we're in a wait and see mode of like, well, listen, I could see it, but I just don't know. Let's see how this turns out over at UC Irvine. Let's see how it turns out for there and everything else. So like it was really just like a wait on the sidelines. I believe, and I'm sure many of us here probably have the same insight, that I believe that there is at every university in North America, I believe that esports as a concept is on a whiteboard somewhere on that campus, right? And I'm sure it gets shuffled around all the time, and it's really just a matter of understanding and where does it fit? I have to build the hospital, I have to fix this dorms, esports are gonna come down here. So it's really wait and see, and how can it be implemented, or should it be, is sort of where we're seeing that space. So really out of all that data, we kind of pulled out these esports findings, right, and global findings. That formal esports programs initiatives on campuses across the country are currently driven by university leadership outside of athletic departments, which is not a surprise, right? It's some stakeholder on campus says like, hey, this could make a lot of sense. Let's onboard this. It could play a role in a lot of different ways. One, engagement. So it's generally not coming from athletics. In some cases it is, particularly in sort of smaller institutions. But generally it's not coming kind of from, and there's like disparate stakeholder initiatives within sort of that recognition space. Student services, if they see value in it, then those priorities are like engagement, right? We have this group on campus, let's really kind of give them something and support this group on campus. But the shortcomings there, sometimes there's limited funding into creating like support structures in like a varsity or in a formal setting. Academic departments, right? I think sometimes the motivation there, or gaming, sometimes you see in gaming, where it's like a STEM initiative in a lot of ways. Like, hey, we recognize that. Yeah, I could say that. We recognize. I think I doubled. Yeah, we recognize that that esports students that are participating in esports collegiate systems over-index as coming from a STEM background. So maybe this is a good way for us to engage that group and to onboard them into our gaming design or into our engineering program, and it could service recruitment and retention efforts. And then when we see some sort of like conference or even networks getting involved, I think that's, like, hey, we're like-minded, but maybe there's a way to monetize what is happening. We're seeing all this kind of esports, and people are paying, $25 million for a franchise spot. Maybe there's a way we could kind of work this up and monetize our situation, what we're doing. The kind of second big finding was administrators with an understanding of esports see value for both their institutions and students through esports participation. Although they recognize that barriers exist, they also see significant opportunity through athletic departments. If you were in the panel earlier where Deppy was moderating and AJ, and he said that he's found that he just duplicates all the capabilities that athletics does every day. He has to do athletics job, what is in traditional sense of like reporting, fundraising, compliance, eligibility, and on top of all that, manage the esports schedule and the groups and the different titles and the club system. So there's a lot of sort of like duplication of services, right? Recruiting, that's like AJ does that. There are mechanisms that athletics has proficiency in a lot of those different ways, facilities management, athletic training and nutrition. So many services get duplicated kind of when it's set up in different elements at a university. And then this speaks to kind of the, I think, the intent. Member institutions have similar ancillary motivations and objectives in pursuing and formalizing esports programs. However, primary esports program goals are variable and correlate strongly to the university's association membership. So this was interesting. So the main reasons of why they'd be schools are interested in esports, it's always a jumbled mix-up order related to what kind of school you are somewhat. So it's engagement, retention, enrollment, cross-pollination of communities, reaching a new subset of student and empowering them, interdisciplinary initiatives, enrollment, the demographic of the student. 74% of League of Legends students that are participating on college teams report to have a 3.0 or higher GPA. Schools love that. It's a great data set. Students engaged in campus programming graduate at a higher rate. So athletics generally graduate at a higher rate. Students involved in clubs graduate at a higher rate. And 47% of League of Legends collegiate players do not participate in traditional campus activities. And that is a massive number. That is a large group that is sort of just in the dark. So as schools identify that, they look across. So in Division I, right, it's like engagement and retention's the headline for them. Yeah, we could do it like that. Maybe we could get a new demographic of student onto our campus and enrolled at our campus, the STEM, the kind of the golden goose of a student that universities are after. And in athletics, right, like UCI does a lot of work, and they have a Division I basketball team and soccer and all the other 14 sports. Maybe there's a way to cross-pollinate this group to our athletic activities, and maybe we can make those athletes pay attention to what we're doing in the esports space, right? And maybe there's a way to monetize this. And there's also like a future of competition. And Division II, engagement and retention is the headline, but then there's also enrollment, right? And that's fine, right? Because I think it can play. I think esports, collegiate esports, can play a role in an enrollment story if done appropriately. And again, cross-promotion, PR, like a lot of schools, like I say, we're the first in this region to add varsity and formal programs, and that's real, right? Because it differentiates potentially a recruiting element or even just like a way that outside would look at a university as being kind of cutting edge. And Division III and NAI, the headline is enrollment, right? It's like, hey, we can differentiate ourselves by onboarding esports, and we can provide value, hopefully, to students and enroll and a new subset of students. So this next slide, and I'm gonna have to bounce. Uh-oh, my mouse died. So this next slide was I'm gonna have to move it manually. Finding one. Sorry. Okay, here we go. Sorry. And the finding four, and this is the fourth of the global, right? Athletic departments could offer significant support to collegiate esports by creating scale through improved structure and organization, and by enhancing campus esports culture and community, which are both essential to esports success. So this is a recognition of really that these communities have grown organically across campuses, and it's not the right approach to sort of just elevate a small subset of the 5 best League of Legends players and remove them from this community group and leave that community group as they exist, because really it's out of the campus goals as well, because they like the competitive element, but they also recognize in every instance that community is also a lifeblood of gaming and esports. So it's not just esports. Esports are a competitive element of gaming. So by enhancing sort of the competitive elements, you would then be able to engage this whole student group and kind of raise all of those student groups' efforts and support them holistically. So really the identification of that varsity and community balance is important. And servicing both is really the alignment that I think most schools are trying to find and mitigate that balance when they approach kind of into that space. Now, when we talk about Now again, this was data was from 2 years ago when, I think there were like, let's see, around 40-ish universities of formal programs. And when I was putting this together for another presentation I did earlier in the summer, this was really shocking to me of how many formal programs there are now. So in 2014, that's Robert Morris, that's one. And here in 2019, we have 270 formal. And again, remembering formal means that there is some institutional support put against the program, which is astonishing. A double-digit percentage growth rate year to year. And again, I think we'll see this increase. Again, with I believe that esports is on every whiteboard at some administrator on campus. So when we look and how that's distributed across the space, this is interesting too as a new development of 18 to 19, because we see the highest percentage growth rate is actually in NCAA Division I space. If this was 2 years ago, you could kind of flip those percentages upside down, where it would be NAI Division III, we're somewhere in the 200 kind of growth rate area, and really a Division I was in the low 20s. So I think this is proof kind of that. If you remember back to the wait and see model, I think that some of the wait and see has been proven out, or at least feel comfortable that they're not putting, Division I universities aren't putting their brand at risk by engaging in video games, that can be done in a meaningful way. I think that probably speaks to a lot of some of the kind of flagship universities like UCI and Utah and how they've onboarded and what that looks like, Boise. So this is really interesting, and also where you see across the space where programs are housed and a lot of different sort of stakeholders on campus. Athletics has 45% of the formal programs, student services and club rec, 49%, and in academic departments, around 6%. And also I think what's worth kind of just as a data set, if you look at the average esports scholarship across the space, it's around $2,200, so $2,200. And in comparison only, right, from scholarshipstats.org, average athletic scholarships, NCAA Division I and II, for males it's $11,500, and for females it's $12,600. And through our research, and really this mirrors sort of at the association level too of the NCAA. There were constant research themes to formal, to across all the pools of amateurism, right? And through our data 2 years ago, that was the headline, oh, students won't be able to stream and they can't monetize their stream. We can't monetize our channel stream. And that was always the headline. And then the response of across all those 125 schools was, I was like, well, how many are monetizing a stream now? None, but we expect to. And that's fine, right? Because I think it's unrealistic to think in 5 years that there won't be serious monetization, potentially, particularly in growth in the high school space. We'll probably develop stars of some kind of an entertainment system. It's really hard to kind of monetize a stream. It takes a lot of work. It's like almost being a full-time entertainer. But understanding, right, that is a trade-off. It's really hard to regulate or even monitor a donation or whatever it would come in. So understanding that is was always a headline concern. Publishers, right? Third-party operators. This is unique to the space, particularly related to NCAA. They don't have to go to football or to basketball or to baseball and say hey, can we run a tournament? It's more just universities deciding. So that's a new element, right? So then the approach we had was this has to be in full partnership with publishers of relevant titles where collegiate esports makes sense, and there needs to be full partnership, side by side, walking if there would be a future within this. There was never a kind of build it and then we're going to go push against them. It's just understanding that is an impossibility. Certainly, equity and Title IX is always a headline through association, also at member institutions, and there's been some really great discourse and dialogue and calling out problems and identifying solutions at this conference. And the NCAA, as an association, recognized that. So we brought any key members, Morgan, NTL, Taylor, to Indianapolis, where it was a 2-day workshop where they met with the diversity and inclusion group. There's 15 full-time people in Indianapolis that all they do is think about diversity, inclusion, and how to help member institutions. And you may have seen I have this one may exist as an outlier. I'll give it to somebody here, but at the end there's a finding paper really that outlines, like, highlights difficulties and also like 12 steps of levers and programs to create to help kind of solve at our universities and colleges of ways to think about and help increase participation and think about right ways to go about diversity inclusion training and everything. And I have a QR code at the end of mine that if you have your phone, you could probably just get it digitally on your phone right there. And content of games, right? Certainly, we had some discussion of that earlier today. The Big East has approached the space, and they want to be additive to the space, but they're like, Counter-Strike, while it's a really relevant title on campuses, like, that's a little too far for us. Terrorist, counter-terrorist, first-person shooter doesn't align with our values, and that's fine, right? I think it's a lot to ask to understand esports and understand every esport related to content and everything else. So, I think just recognition of esports and titles that feel comfortable are a great start, and it makes a ton of sense. Also, departmental oversight and the NCAA approach to this was surprisingly open, and it's like, hey, schools as a member service organization, right? They service the membership. If UCI wants to have it out of student services, great, right? I think it can be enhanced by some elements of athletics. On this campus. If the University of Utah wants to have it in the game design program, spectacular. There's maybe perhaps elements from athletics that could help support and bolster. Maybe the NCAA as an organization could help bolster and help publisher efforts related to their efforts in collegiate support. And student support, right? Like, what is the right ways of from formal to varsity, or what does that look like? What are minimum levels that sort of should be a standard? And I heard a lot of discussion here of like standardization of programs. Like, what makes sense, right? Because I think you could say, hey, we have Varsity Esports, and you can have like a closet of 4 computers that you just took from your computer lab, and say you have Varsity Esports because you're providing a space, right? But is that really delivering the value kind of to students? So, like, it'd be interesting to see a standard set of kind of what that means. And then also, I think it's just a barrier that exists too, and some of the themes were like, we don't get esports. What do you mean video games? How does that add value? How does that, I don't understand the industry, and it makes sense from athletic administrators and even just presidents and provosts who are probably of a certain age. It's just like it never would have occurred to them or crossed their mind that competitive esports, competitive video games, potentially structured, can be a beneficial tool, can be a learning aid. And again, what I think is interesting about the space, and I'll get to campus esports, and this is almost like the reasons why, right? The reasons to believe across like sort of the key stakeholders within. But it does create, I think, which is a unique separation of power in an idealized world, right? Like, whereas publishers, they are for-profit institutions, right? And they want to make money, and by making money, they like more players playing longer is like the goal. Now, certainly, like, some publishers have different views, and it's really like want to be a service element to the player and player experience, and that's awesome. But between publishers, universities, and student groups and communities, we see kind of like an interesting like trifecta triangle, which potentially I think people see as a negative, but it could be positioned as a positive, where universities want to do X, Y, Z, publishers don't align, it doesn't make sense, and they'd be able to push back. And so that through that partnership and through that arbitration of ideas and goals of onboarding collegiate esports and mentoring it forward, we have a unique sort of triangular subset of goals that have to be managed and worked across this space. Now, going back to the NEKey report that may or may have not been initialized by some sort of school organization, association that may have been scrubbed from all mention, but it calls out, and I think this leads into kind of the next subsection, is like what challenges in collegiate esports, because there's many. I think college esports are in a almost like a frail space right now. Despite all the growth and everything else, there's not a whole lot of direction of what's going to happen. So this open market offers and invites a lot of weird things of like, hey, we're going to be the next NCAA Esports. We're going to do X, Y, and Z. Or hey, we have a platform which can help your students and it will make them rich, and they can play for $100 every day. So there's a lot of weird sort of actors that I think when like VC groups look and see college sports and see the growth of collegiate esports and say like, opportunity, let's get after it and let's figure it out. So that's what I think like through the report, and I'm not going to go through all this because you should 100% read this, digest it, and activate non-university actors, commercial models, right, where an open system, I mentioned this on a panel earlier, right, if there was no sort of rule set or structures or guidance to athletics, I'm pretty sure female athletics wouldn't exist at all. If it's only like, listen, what do we care? It's like, let's just let the market dictate. I'm not sure that's best served to the students and to their educational experiences and why athletics exists at universities to enrich character and growth and personal growth. There's barriers to equity, which we know, and this is like the highlight of what can we do. So this calls out the problems, and then there's 12 steps that I think suggest to universities. Overrepresentation of PC gaming, it's true. We have Smash is our only title that we support at Robert Morris University, and limited scope of diversity. And again, so I have a QR code for that. It's hyper important. I think that we all digest that and look at it. So I think really over the next kind of couple of years, as collegiate esports is kind of like moving around and wobbling around, we're going to go through some growing pains. I think like college esports are in this existential crisis of open market, right? Right now it's kind of like trying to be steered by publishers and a couple university, I think, leaders that sort of have agency and say like, I'm not sure this is the best for everything. Maybe we should put some structure around this. But it's hard to sort of wrap your arms around the whole entity of collegiate esports. We're seeing competitive incentives. I believe this is going to be a further developing problem over time, where we've seen the growth of 270 now formal programs. Now as schools start to put funding and support behind, even sometimes in varsity where they're scholarshiping student athletes, my worry is that if these programs are just set up and operating kind of on their own in a silo without any real oversight from a university, without university agency, it's just operating there as an enrollment factor or whatever else have you, whatever kind of stake, that there won't be the sort of academic rigor and sort of watchful eye on top, and competitive elements may take precedent to student outcomes. Right, where we say like, hey, our team's not that good. Let's wipe them for next semester and bring in some better players. So we're spending a lot of money here. We want to make sure we're successful. Esports student success, right? That should be, to me, should be the shining star or the North Star for all initiatives related to kind of formalization or varsity programs. That should be the measure. Is like value to the student to meet their expectations, so then they can have a good experience and then be a successful citizen in the world, right? Like operating. Maybe it's professional esports. Maybe they're that good and maybe they're an accountant, right? But their experience should be that value should be delivered to their experience. Scholastic Esports legislation, we're seeing this a lot now. NASEF in their conference, which is an organizing kind of body, are wrestling with this. Like, okay, we're seeing rampant mistreatment in transferring. Again, I think to some of those competitive elements being highlighted, that there's no rules. We're seeing students from, again, like 2014 was the first varsity program. There are students that have bounced around between 4 different universities on varsity programs. And I'm not sure that's like the best look for all of collegiate esports, but I suspect that sort of environment is what's being bred right now, and will only be amplified. And also, like what are guidelines? Should we be worried about setting standards for academic progress or GPA requirements or entry requirements? What about recruiting elements and identification in that process? So there's everyone's trying to, RSAA is trying to figure this out and sort of set guidelines. And what's interesting is like athletic associations have ad nauseum solved this, right? Now it may be overbearing, but they've put 60 years of work into solving all those problems. And the rule book is this big, but then the case book is this big, because there are things they didn't even imagine or think about, but then get solved in the case book. So collegiate esports legislation is in the baby infant steps of saying like, hey, maybe we should think about this. And it's a long way to go before we get to the rules and then the rules of the rules. An esports silo, this is a growing pain that I'm seeing more and more of, like, as different stakeholders on campus recognize some value play in esports. It could be housing. They're like, man, this is a great way. I'm in charge of housing. I'm going to put a 7-person LAN space in every basement of our housing spaces. At that same campus, there could be, through the media studies group, is say like, hey, we're going to form a broadcasting element that will broadcast esports competitions. And in the game design program, they're saying like, hey, we're going to have a formal program. So like each sort of looking out for their own silo and wanting esports and engaging and onboarding esports without sort of like an overall arched umbrella mentality, because it's happening, the identification of value in each of these disparate sort of like spaces on campus. And also the rise of the esports major, right? I think there's value to sort of like or co-curricular, interdisciplinary elements, but and I think there is value there, but I worry sometimes that some schools can use like an esports major as a predatory element, right? And I feel like sometimes administrators mix up the numbers of gaming industry and esports industry, because esports industry is like a subset of that whole gaming industry. And I don't know if we need to graduate, 20,000 students that can set up a LAN competition as our best use of like our educational resources. I think it could be an element, just knowing what goes into it and what are sort of aspects. But like, I think related study to media related to esports, to perhaps like the marketing elements of esports and some of those sort of deeper thought questions, like rather than like, you will learn how to run an event, and then you can go run an event. Like, maybe, I'm not sure if that's, and I'm not the gatekeeper of it, but I'm seeing that definitely been onboarded at a higher level now and more frequently. And I'm just calling out as like, we should definitely as a group pay attention to it. And also, I think what's massively lacking in this space is data. Again, this data is 2 years old and still somewhat relevant, but there's no entity to sort of say like, hey, how many formal programs? This is my guess, right? This is me scraping the internet and reaching out and hearing from everybody and putting it together, and then also piecemeal. Okay, where's it going to sit? And then what kind of support is there? Is there staffing? But we don't really have good data. All we have is like attitudinal data that we have, but we don't know program year-over-year metrics. How many people are graduating? What's the overall GPA of formal programs of those competing in competitions across esports programs? What's the operating cost per student? What's the scholarship data? What's the production data? How many hours? How many people are working on that? What's the equipment outlay? What's the staffing related to that? Student outcome data. How many are graduating? What are their majors? What's their demographics? Who's applying? Varsity student sentiment data. What was your experience in a formal program? What was your varsity experience like? What are ways to iterate in this college space? Gender, diversity, inclusion, measurable data effort of improvement. There is none of that. There is none of that. Right now there's no way to get it because it's so spread out, and I think it's needed desperately. So those that have like advanced programs, I would say as much as you could put like your PhD, master students in those sort of efforts, I think it would help the space tremendously. But I just think, again, just with the NCAA work, when the NCAA does a project or they look into a subset of students or the increase of females, if they an emerging sport, and what has that done from university on to high school, it's a 80-page document, right, with data and stats and everything else, like talk about outcomes and risks and what and adversity and how to overcome. So, like this sort of being collegiate esports being so disparate, there is no entity sort of to collect all that and sort of rein it in. And again, so the path forward, right? So it's I think all of us, and it's been highlighted a couple times, is that I think still, and again, if you look at like there's 270 formal programs, well, there's like there's over 1,200 NCAA institutions. There's 250 NAI institutions. There's hundreds of NJCAA institutions. So while we see like we've come a long way, there's still a long way to go, and a lot of schools that are not involved or don't want to be involved. So I think that education piece still is lacking. I think it's all on all of us to try to solve some of that and serve membership and help out. And that's really the NCAA's role, right? I think, and I've had like long conversations in this time here of like, well, the NCAA could just come in. That's not how that entity works. Like it's surprising. It gets how it gets personified sometimes. It is literally that association is moved by 15 presidents of universities across Division 1, 2, and 3. And what they say is what gets actionable by that association. So there's no world where the NCAA takes a leadership position and says like, hey, we're going to do this, and then you schools pay attention. It's 100% backwards. That the universities say like, hey, we should think about this, and then they act, which is important, right? And I think like there's no world, even if those board of governors would say like, tomorrow we want this as a varsity 91st championship sport, and we're going to do it, right? There's no world where there's a green button that says go. There is a multi-year pathing, I believe, that has to occur to cultivate the space in education, in what are the rule sets that gets formed by sort of like those in esports leadership at the university side, a cross section of academics, of conferences, of presidents, of esports directors that sort of shape what that looks like. And through all this data, when we took it back to the NCAA, we presented the data, and through Intersport, we presented sort of like just different light frameworks of potential onboarding, right? Here's ways you could add to the space and ways you could be potentially engaged in the space. Took that data back out to a working group, which was made up of 25 university NCAA membership administrators, presidents, esports leads, students, conferences, and sort of vetted that and said, okay, well, it can iterate like this, and publishers. So we reached out to publishers and sort of had alignment, or like at least a paired vision of what it could be. And there's real recognition, I could say, that it doesn't have to be, and there's recognition that it's a square peg, round hole, and that there has to be iteration to the approach of this, like just conceptual global, or not global, like administrative group that can kind of help with what's happening on campuses. So while people, I think it's easy to read in the headlines and everything else of sort of the negative elements of NCAA. I think the way they approach the space has been really intentful and like measured, and not wanting to disrupt what's been created and try to be additive to everything. And particularly in light of what's happening in California and all the legislation, and understanding that one of the headlines all the time was amateurism, right? Maybe there's form. What will that look like in 2 years? What will the like traditional sports look like, right? Maybe there's ways that iterates, which would be beneficial potentially to collegiate esports and sort of solve for, like, I think, one of the largest sentiments to NCAA vitriol. So it's kind of interesting times, but like leadership education is important. I think potentially even NCAA could play a role with there. So like the NCAA process through those 2 years was research, brought back, iterated, frameworks, light frameworks, potential business case, worked hand in hand with publishers, brought back, and there were multiple measures and times. The board of governors meet quarterly, and then the 4:30 meeting was where it got tabled, right? So it was there's 15 board of governors. There were 12 in the room at the time. There was a motion put forward, said like, hey, NCAA, if membership asks, will cultivate and try to work towards a space where potentially there would be a 91st championship sport, and that's where it kind of was sort of put on pause, right? So the vote was 6-6, and it was tabled. So I think the media headline was like, NCAA's out. They're not governing esports. They're done. That's it. Forget it. Which I think led to like an interesting kind of. This is a good case study too for business classes of what happened in the market, because then I think then VCs are like, oh, great opportunity. And you see a lot of the activity of like, we are going to do it then. But in reality, it's sort of just on a timeout. Does it come back? It may never come back. Will it come? Could it potentially come back? I think maybe it could. But that's just the pure process of what happened and where it is now. Understanding that the next meeting is in October, where there is a committee formed by the NCAA to take a look and provide information on name, image, and likeness. Val Ackerman from the Big East leads that group, and there's Gene Smith from Ohio State is on there, and a bunch of really important people in the NCAA space. And they will give those findings. So that is kind of just where everything stands in that space right now. I know there's a lot of mystery because there's not a whole lot of communication about it. Really, I think like the path forward too is like, and I believe that this is really a good starting point for all of us in the university space, is like in developing equitable and inclusive programs, and this is a good sort of 12-step program, or at least to start thinking about it, because I think everyone wants to, didn't have actionable steps. Now I think we have clear actionable steps delivered by professionals that we all should start trying to onboard and think about. And also like esports administration and best services. I think this happens all the time in the shadows, right? From someone calling to someone else to someone else to someone else saying like, how do you do it? How do you do it? How do you do it? But like establishing a guideline, I think can just add value. And I think it goes back up to university esports, kind of just like understanding the space. But we all need to have a kind of a shared voice of like, hey, we do probably think like students should be graduating out of formal esports programs. And what are ways that we can kind of make sure that that's happening at some rate? So that's probably the hardest part, but I think it's important, particularly in the light that, again, with like esports education, and you guys probably all know this, but it still suffers from this stereotype of video games like waste of time. What are you talking about? Pac-Man, Donkey Kong? No, that's not going to be involved in we are not putting our brand on top of that. But when we start to look past those best practices and student outcomes, and if we have bad student outcomes, or there's a student that fails out or is caught cheating or something, then I think it's easy just to put the blame back on, of course, it's video games. What would you expect? They're a bunch of losers. So I think we have to be really careful about the narratives coming out and protect the positive narratives coming out and make sure that they are positive. And I think there's really room to work with publishers, right? I believe that they brought us a long way into this space. So how are ways that sort of the university community can work with publishers to think about it holistically and onboard and create sort of safe environments for students that are sort of value driven and worried about those student outcomes. And really, just in sum it up, I pulled out here as just a quote from this paper from NEKey related to university college esports, and this is the QR code that if you have a phone, I hope it'll work from where you are, but you could have it and on the flight home or wherever you go, read it and digest it. But as educators, right, and even as a college soccer coach, I considered my educator. As an educator, I call myself a teacher in shorts because I believe like that second classroom elements were just as important as the physics classes that I was teaching character and developing players and people at the same time, which I believe esports is doing and we're all doing. So really, like through that lens, and through esports is the medium like to deliver that education and all of those value-driven lessons to add value to that student experience, so that when they graduate and 10 years later, they're like, oh my God, that was so great, and my teammates and my coach. And I always say, I'm still in contact with my high school and my college soccer coach. I don't talk to one teacher from my high school. I don't talk to one teacher from my university. It's a unique bond that's created through athletic competition that is unlike, in my opinion, anything else. And we need to decide together, like universities, game developers, students, like the right path forward. And there isn't like a true right path forward. And Glenn from Miami, Ohio University says something today, which I'm totally going to steal and use all the time, that esports isn't, when we're thinking about like athletic inclusion or it's in student services, that it's like esports and the way gaming and esports, I believe, and what we're seeing is engaging on campus is like a thing of a third kind. And it is, right? But it's unique to the space because it has so many interdisciplinary potentials co-curricular potentials and competitive and community potential. But there's nothing really on campus that reaches across all those silos and unites them. So really thinking about that umbrella package and how that can potentially play a role at universities and scholastic institutions is, I think, the right way forward, but not the easiest, right? It's the most difficult, but potentially would add the most value to not just the students, but for publishers and for universities. So again, at the end, I believe that the shining star, because it can get muddied in like research as a highlight or what the headline is. The headline to me in this space is the reason it exists is because video games are fun. Competitive video games are even more fun. Competitive video games playing with your friends are even more fun. The community surrounding it is fun. And all those things and those elements can play a role and layer on top and play in a different level of importance depending upon what your university's goals are. But that's the headline, is like, this is fun. Competition is fun. You can get real lessons out of those competitions, and we should definitely be working to foster and maintain that. And student values, right? Student outcomes, their experience on campus, and all the work that we're doing to service it, I believe should be the guiding North Star to all collegiate sort of campus, varsity, formal, community, rec initiatives, and we should not lose sight of it. Thanks.